You're listening to the Literary Atlanta podcast. I'm Allison Law, and it's 2018 Best of issue. Atlanta Magazine named the Atlanta History Center and Margaret Mitchell House the best venues for story time for adults, and gives proper credit to Kate Whitman, Vice President of Author and Family Programs, for this recognition. In the accompanying story, the magazine quotes Kate as saying she has one simple goal: to put Atlanta on the map as a place where writers can connect with their readers. The Atlanta History Center hosts numerous big-name writers, historians, celebrity chefs, memoirists, news anchors, and the like, from Doris Kearns Goodwin to the author of Crazy Rich Asians, Kevin Kwan. Atlanta Magazine quotes Kate as saying she is addicted to getting the ungettable. It's been my privilege in the last handful of years to meet and get to know Kate, and I was thrilled when she invited me to moderate my first author event at the Margaret Mitchell House on February 27th. On tap for that evening were two authors from one of my favorite imprints, Algonquin Publishing. And, of course, I brought along my trusty mobile microphone so I could record our chat for you. My conversation with authors B.A. Shapiro and Tim Johnston is straight ahead on episode 56 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. B.A. Shapiro is the author of the award-winning New York Times bestseller, The Art Forger, and the best-selling follow-up, The Muralist. The Collector's Apprentice, which was published last October, is her third title with Algonquin and under the pen name B.A. Shapiro. She has 5 other novels, The Safe Room, Blind Spot, See No Evil, Blameless, and Shattered Echoes, and has also written 4 screenplays and the nonfiction book, The Big Squeeze. She's taught sociology at Tufts University and creative writing at Northeastern University. She lives in Boston with her husband Dan and their dog Sagan. Tim Johnston, a native of Iowa City, is the author of The Current, which was published by Algonquin about a month and a half ago. It's also a follow-up to his New York Times bestseller, Descent. He's written a young adult novel, Never So Green, and the story collection Irish Girl, which won an O. Henry Prize and the Catherine Ann Porter Prize in Short Fiction. Tim's stories have appeared in numerous esteemed journals and publications. He holds degrees from the University of Iowa and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In 2011 to 12, he was a writing fellow at the George Washington University, and in 2015, he received the Iowa Author Award. Tim currently lives in Iowa City, Iowa. Now that we have the bios for these two authors, I will preface this recording by saying that the acoustics in the Margaret Mitchell House, where we were on February 27th, were not ideal for my microphone setup. And that is no one's fault but my own. I had my microphone and Zoom recorder set up on a small table placed between Barbara Shapiro and myself. But I want you to know that it is worth your while to bear with the acoustics, as these two generous writers covered so many great topics. Everything from their very different approaches to ratcheting up the tension in scenes, placing young women characters in dangerous situations and writing them out of those circumstances, imagining and describing what it would feel like to crash into a snowy, icy, dark, raging river in wintry northern Iowa, or to crash one of Gertrude Stein's bohemian dinner parties in 1920s Paris. Enjoy this conversation with authors B.A. Shapiro and Tim Johnston. I wanted to touch on the fact that your books are in some ways similar and in some ways wildly different. And it reminded me of a section of your book, The Collector's Apprentice, where the collector, who's Dr. Edwin Bradley, he's not very well respected in the art world. And one reason is because he likes to create groupings of pictures and kind of throw everything up on the wall as opposed to have to showcasing one portrait on a wall, and he calls this ensembles. Can you introduce us to why he was a fan of the ensembles and why people would want to do that? Share different works that are both different and then also look for their similarities.
Well, Edwin Bradley, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, but Edwin Bradley is actually Albert Barnes. And Albert Barnes collected post-impressionists and other types of art in the 1920s when no one in America thought these paintings were worthwhile. When he had an exhibit in Philadelphia, they just made fun of him. They said, "What is Cézanne? You know, everybody knows that the sky isn't blue. And Matisse, how come he doesn't have any perspective? How can you be an artist without perspective?" And he tried to bring this kind of art to Philadelphia, who rejected him. But he also was he's a real Renaissance man. And so he was a collector, he was a curator, he was a doctor, he ran a business that made millions of dollars developing drugs. And he also was pretty much a jerk. And he had enemies everywhere he went. But he also was a brilliant curator. And he was the first person to create what he called ensembles. Before him, all art museums were organized by time. So the Renaissance people were over here, the Greeks were over here, the Romans, the Impressionists, they were in different areas. What he tried to do was organize art by the principles of art that he felt were the most important, like line, shape, color, and he would take paintings that could be, Greek or Renaissance and post-impressionist, and he would put them all up on a wall as an ensemble, maybe 15, 20 of them, along with things like keys and locks and little pieces of metal and furniture, and all of the things had a thematic whole to them. And what he wanted was for people to look at this art and not think, who painted this and who painted that and what year is it? He didn't want the little white cards. He wanted people to think about the art and to appreciate it for the qualities that you might miss had you just looked at the little white card and the year. Is that the answer to the question that you wanted?
That was a brilliant answer.
The way you asked doesn't sound like a bad idea.
It's not a bad idea. It wasn't his ensemble so much. I mean, everybody was shocked, but it was mostly the art that he had the audacity to bring these people who didn't know anything about art, like Matisse and Picasso, Cézanne, Modigliani, those people.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things too, as we continue this grouping of you both, one of the things that both of your books has is something that's happening on the surface and then things that are raging underneath. And I feel like that is one of the main metaphors of the current. So can you tell us a little bit about that book? Tell us immediately what's happening on the surface, and then maybe we can step into some of the underlying themes in the book.
Okay, yes. It's hard to avoid talking about that with the title, The Current,
right.
And the undercurrents and the undertows. And it's an apt metaphor. It's purposeful. It wasn't always there. But to answer your question, on the surface, there's a couple of crimes. There are two crimes that are separated by 10 years, and they both involve young women who drowned in the same river. And one happens in a small town in Minnesota, and one happens when two young women are on their way to that same town in Minnesota, and they end up being sort of forced off the icy road into the icy river. And one of them lives and one of them doesn't. And the one who lives continues on to that small town, and the connection between her life and that former 10 years ago crime is her father was the sheriff 10 years ago who was unable to solve that crime. And in a sense, she sort of picks up where he left off. That's essentially what's going on the surface. It's kind of a small town story where everybody kind of knows everybody, and there's a lot of sort of suspicion, there's a lot of grief. A lot of people have never gotten over what happened 10 years ago, and on this new sort of crime brings it all up to the surface, if you will. And so there's this current of crime and murder and drowning underneath, and suspicion and guilt, and does the justice system work or does it not work? And that's about as deep as I can go right at the moment.
So to speak.
Yes.
Puns everywhere.
Well, one of the things, another similarity between the two books is that you both have young women who are your protagonists. They're both 19 really when we meet them, and they are they both find themselves on their own. They've been, in your case, abandoned by their family for different circumstances. The other one has been orphaned. So do you want me to call you B.A. or Barbara?
You can call me Barbara.
Okay, Barbara. Barbara, will you tell us about Pauline, who becomes Vivian for most of the book, and why was it important for you to build that narrative of her being abandoned by her family?
Well, what happened with this book is that I originally started out telling the real story of Albert Barnes and Violette DiMaggio. And I spent a year or so working on it, and it turned out to be really boring. What happened was he had all of these paintings. He had like 3,000 works of art in the Barnes Foundation, and he, in his will, said he would not let anybody come in and see it. It wasn't a museum because people were too stupid to appreciate the art. And it ended up, so in his will, he said none of the ensembles could be changed, and he said that none of these paintings could be moved. But they are all now in the city of Philadelphia in this low-slung concrete building instead of this beautiful mansion that he put in the suburbs. And so that's what the original book was going to be about. How did this happen? Who owns art? How do you break the will? And it was so boring that I decided I had to create a backstory for his assistant apprentice, Violette DiMaggio. So I fictionalized them both, and I gave Pauline a backstory where she grew up very, very wealthy in Belgium, and her father was fabulously wealthy, and he had this fabulous art collection, and she falls in love with this handsome, charismatic, brilliant, very wealthy man named George, and he is a financier, and she begs him to allow her and her family and all their friends to invest with him because he makes lots of money. And they're engaged, and they're planning a huge wedding, and he leaves her at the altar, having stolen all of her money, all of her family's money, all of their friends, all of their aunts, uncles, and cousins. And her parents kick her out of the house because they believe that she must have known what he was doing. So she is 19, alone on her own, without any real skills, and she is pissed off at George. And she has to get revenge, but she also has to figure out a way to make her way in the world. And she's forced to change her name because there are people from Belgium and a few other places who are looking to get her, to punish her. And so she takes on a new identity. And I didn't realize until, really, I think it was after the book was published, that I had written a coming-of-age story. It's so funny how these things happen. And that's what happened. She goes out and she tries to figure out how to establish herself as a person. Her father lost his art collection. She wants to get it back for him. And George, who also is Benjamin, Ashton, Tex, and a few other people, is this con man extraordinaire. he is like amazing, and he comes back and he tries to get her again and again, and she starts to learn from him how to con people. So in the story, there's all these cons and counter cons, and it was really fun.
So Tim, kind of building on that question or that subject, we also, both of your books have young women who are making their way in the world by themselves, and there are inherent dangers in that, and also challenges that they have to overcome. So will you talk a little bit about the challenges that Audrey has making her way in the world, and how you also built at some point some very terrifying scenes of the dangers that she's facing as she's investigating this, well, actually kind of two crimes.
Yeah, she doesn't have an easy way. It's a kind of a theme, a kind of story I've been pursuing in one way or another for a long time. You know, ever since I was writing short stories, there were terrible things happening to innocent people. And we haven't quite figured out in therapy why I keep going back to that. I figure if I write about
that's what makes a good story. You gotta give them trouble.
It doesn't have anything to do with me. I had a perfectly normal childhood. It felt natural for me to put two young women at the beginning of this book as the catalyst for everything that happens. And it's also just in a kind of as a note on my process, it's more interesting for me to write about people who are wildly different from who I am. You know, so to imagine 19-year-old college women is a good challenge for me. It makes it more interesting and fun for me. But being 19 and young, and this is true in the world that we live in, there are dangers out there, and Audrey and Caroline run into dangers before they even get to the river. They run into a couple of characters at a remote gas station in Iowa, a couple of young local yokels who give them a hard time, actually assault them, and they get away from that only to end up sort of forced into the river. But then when she gets to the small town of Minnesota and she becomes more and more involved in that old case, she begins, stepping on toes and sort of rousing old ghosts and demons and dangerous sorts who pretty much want her to stop doing what she's doing. But again, this is you can't really write about anyone under the age of 40 probably without it turning into some kind of coming of age story. And she sort of must rise to the occasion again and again and learn and become sort of a stronger person and a more resilient person and a braver person in a way, while she's still being attacked by nefarious elements.
Definitely, and I think that while Audrey is pursuing truth and peace for the families who have been affected by these two crimes, that Pauline, who becomes Vivian, has different pursuits. She wants to restore her family and the reputation, and then she wants revenge. Who hasn't asked themselves the question, if you were to host a dinner party, who would you want to invite, living or dead? You all have heard that question before. Well, I feel like, Barbara, you just went ahead and said, why would I host a dinner party when I could just make my characters crash one of Gertrude Stein's dinner parties? Because your characters are hanging out with these amazing people in 1920s Paris. Will you tell us what that was like to recreate those scenes and have them interact with those real life?
It was so cool. It was so cool. I mean, Gertrude Stein is this crazy character. She's like this little elf of a woman. And then she had her elfin lover, who was even stranger, Alice B. Toklas. But she held these fabulous soirees in her home, and they were filled with art, and they were the artists and the writers. And so there's, Matisse and Picasso and Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Thornton Wilder. I mean, these people were just there. And so I did a bunch of research on each one of these people and, read Gertrude's Between You and Me, really horrible books, but don't tell her. Yeah, I could not understand half of what she was trying to say. But, and then I got to imagine myself through the characters being there, and what would those conversations have been like, and who was arguing with whom and why. And one of the things that I try to do when I'm writing a character is imagine myself as them. And I do research kind of the way I think maybe an actor researches a part, and then try to be that person. So I got to walk into Gertrude Stein's salon, be introduced to Matisse, listen to Matisse and Picasso fight, and then listen to Edwin Bradley fight with everybody else, including Gertrude. And so for a while, I got to be in like that Woody Allen movie, where the guy goes out at midnight in Paris, where he gets into the cab and he goes there. So I would just go to my desk and I would go to Gertrude Stein's salon in Paris in the rain in the 1920s. It's always raining.
Yeah. So let's juxtapose that with contemporary Iowa and Minnesota. I'm not sure you got that piece of advice that you're supposed to write the book where you want a vacation, what I ordered.
Well, I had to go to Paris to do research.
Yeah?
It was terrible.
Yeah.
A whole week looking at Matisse's paintings. Oh, it was awful.
No, I think Iowa City is lovely, but I think I needed a blanket when I was reading your book, because it does take place in the wintertime. It's all I can think of are the scenes about this town, are them riding back and forth on these trestle bridges across the upper and the lower river, and how they're always saying, well, how does a river change? How does it become one thing and the next? So will you tell us a little bit about the geography there and how it plays a role in the book?
This will be a pretty short answer. It's Iowa. It's the flyover zone. It's Iowa and Minnesota. It's northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. And I will admit this, unlike Barbara who went to Paris, I never went to Minnesota once to research this book. It's entirely made up. That small town I described, and even the river, is made up. As a kid, I remember we went on summer canoeing trips on the upper Iowa River. So in this book, it's called the Upper Blackroot River and the Lower Blackroot River. So I was just sort of transposing my own memory of the river and transposing it from summer to winter. And I could see on the map that certain rivers do cross borders. They come down from Minnesota and they come into Iowa. And since I'm about central Iowa and I've spent a good amount of time in northern Iowa, I didn't think it was too much of a stretch for me to make up southern Minnesota. So that's it, the geography is just it's the plains, but in Minnesota it's very watery, as a lot of lakes, a land of 10,000 lakes and rivers. So I knew that water would be central to the story, and frozen water in particular. Although we do reach spring at the end of the book, and it does begin to thaw, and you can take off some of your layers and kick back a little. But that's really, it's really just walking outside my door in another city and going, oh, it's cold as frickin' out here. What's that feel like? The only thing I had to really imagine was what it would be like to actually fall through the ice, fully go through the ice until you're like looking up at the ice. And that was just the process of just what Barbara did, just trying to imagine what it would be like to be that person going through those experiences.
I wondered when I was reading the book and you were talking about the experiences, because you described not only Audrey's recollections of being underneath the ice, but her recovery afterward. Did you research to see if there were all of these, I'm thinking like she was very thirsty, she has all of these vivid dreams and sees things, and here is that typical of someone who's gone through hypothermia or something? I don't know.
Yeah. I guess I'm just going to admit that I'm not a big researcher. I mean, I find out little things when I need them, like, what kind of car a sheriff in Minnesota would likely to be driving, what kind of cruiser, how do you load a deer rifle, these kinds of things that I don't really know, I would look up. But I knew that she had nearly frozen and that she had had a traumatic experience, and the rest I just made up. And part of what happens to her underwater, I think, is kind of, it's almost mystical. Her friend is in the water with her, and something happens that's kind of not quite on this earth, and so she has recollections that she's not sure are true recollections. And the reader, I don't think, is sure either, but there's something uncanny about her recovery and what's happened to her once she survives that trauma.
We may not have done the research, but it was incredibly believable and really scary.
Writer.
Both of you have written books where you're kind of have a little bit of cat and mouse and trying to figure out how to outthink a person. How fun is it to write that, Barbara?
Oh, it's a lot of fun. But we do it very different ways.
That's true. You want to expand on that a little bit now that you've had some time you've read each other's books and you've had some time to talk about them now?
Tim always objects. I am a very cowardly writer because I need to know that my book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I also am trained as a statistician. I have a PhD in sociology because this is what you need to write a novel, right? So I use statistical techniques to write the novel, to figure out how to play the cat and mouse game. You probably don't know, because I made it up, that every story follows a normal curve. The story, the plot, the subplot, the character arcs, and this can be divided into 4 equal parts, which match the 4 acts in story structure. I also use bubblegrams to assess the relationships between all of the people, like who had to meet Gertrude in order for that to happen to Vivienne. My favorite thing that I do is I create tension charts where I assign every scene that I write a tension coefficient. You can't have a scene that has no tension in it. It would just be boring. But sometimes you have to have a scene that doesn't have all that much tension in it. So, it's like after a big scene, or you're creating some background. And so those scenes get the tension coefficient of 0.25. If there's more going on, then they get the tension coefficient of 0.50. If there's a lot going on, it's 0.75. And if it's a really, really big, it gets 1.0, which corresponds back to the 4 major plot points on the normal curve for the end of each act. Then I do something really sophisticated that, I don't know, if you're not a statistician, you might not understand. I use multicolored bio cards. And I plot out every single one of the stories, every single one of the characters. And so say, for example, Pauline has 15 major plot points in her story. So I take 15 red cards and I put each major plot point on that. Vivienne has 25. George has, Vivian has 50, George has 25. And I tried to find black file cards for George, but I found some dark purple ones. And I do this, so I did it for all the characters, I did it for the legal stuff, I did it for also, Vivian is on trial for Edwin's murder at the beginning, so there was that whole trial thing. And then I take this, so I end up with a stack of green, red, blue, yellow, purple. I have to go to Staples and like get all of these different cards when I have a lot of different people and a lot of different points in a book, because I can't have the same color, right? That would be too confusing. And then I lay them out back into the 4-act structure that they all started with and play around until I can get the cat and mouse game going. Tim, on the other hand, is a very brave writer.
See, the reason I object to that cowardly business, anybody who sets out to write a book by any process is not cowardly. You know, that's a brave thing to do by whatever means you do it. That's why I always object to that word. I know what you're saying. And I have to say that, you know, I've taken a fair number of writing classes and I've never been taught that. You really did make that up.
I made it up.
That's your own system.
I'm an English major, and I have to say I'm at 1.2 on the tension chart right now. Just thinking about that.
I still think you ought to teach that class at MIT, creative writing. Statistics and creative writing. I think that'd be a great class for them. So yeah, as you might have guessed, I have a very different kind of process for figuring out cat and mouse. I take a cat, and I take a mouse, and I will let them go. And I don't really know what's going to happen to either one of them. Or if one is really a cat, or might also just be a mouse in disguise. I don't know. But I'm going to figure that out as I follow them along. I'm going to see where they do, and I'm going to see what they do, and I'm going to learn their characters as I go. So I don't plot. There's no color-coded cards in my house. They're not allowed. I have nothing against them. I think if you want to use them, that's what you should do. But I've always felt like I want to be, and I know that people who plot like Barbara does are also surprised. They don't always follow that plot. Things change. Mm-hmm. Cards get tossed out and new cards come in. But I always just like the idea of being surprised as I go by what people are doing or how they're reacting. And I think I'm trying to emulate the reading experience and the writing experience. I just want to have a good sort of interesting writing experience as you do when you read. It's a little more controlled, and I begin to take a little more. As I get closer to the end, I have a little better idea of what's going to happen. Characters have taken their shape, and I know who the cat is now and who the mouse is, and you probably do too, and that's okay. But it's just a completely different kind of process.
But don't you think that's brave to sit there and start when you don't know, and then you could spend 2 years and then you couldn't figure out the end.
That's happened.
Yeah. It sounds very brave to me.
I think both sound utterly terrifying and brave to me. But you both do it so well. I mean, especially you've both written books that you do ratchet up the tension. How do you do that?
There's really no right or wrong way to write a novel. Every novelist writes a novel differently. We even write our own novels differently depending on what they call for. And there are certain things that you have to do eventually. You have to deal with plot and character and setting, and you got to deal with your themes, and you got to make sure that the reader is interested and you keep their attention. But which one you do first doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
I'll comment on that.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot, but one of the things I spent a lot of my sort of formative cutting my teeth time in creative writing environments. I was at the University of Iowa as an undergraduate, and I became sort of sucked into that vortex of creative writing classes. And then I was encouraged by my professors, and so I went to get my MFA at the University of Massachusetts. My point is, we didn't really talk a lot about suspense or crime or thrillers in those kinds of classes. These were sort of academic-y, liberal arts, literary courses, where genre was kind of not really considered, the thing you were meant to pursue.
Plot is a bad word.
Yeah. So what they talk about instead, and particularly when you're just working on short stories as a young apprentice, is you want a conflict in your story. That's where you begin. And they define conflict as your character simply wanting something, and your character can't get that thing because you have put obstacles in his or her way. So that's the conflict. And the greater the conflict, the more that there's tension. And I think that over time, as you grow up, and it took me, once I graduated from UMass, it was another 20 years before I started writing the book that I wrote before The Current, which was Descent. And what happened at that time is I began to ration up the conflict and the tension, and that led to greater suspense. And one way you do that is by just having higher stakes. Very few of my short stories was there a cat and mouse. There was often just a mouse that got mauled or whatever, to try and stretch the metaphor, and there was no resolution to that poor mouse. And you could do that in a short story.
The only writing course I ever took was I live in Boston, at the Cambridge Center of Adult Ed, and I took a novel writing course and met my writers group, none of whom had ever taken a novel writing course. And we kind of taught ourselves how to write novels. So this is where we're coming from, completely different places, but here we are on the same stage with the same publisher. So,
yeah, I was surprised to learn, because one of my favorite books from 2012 was The Art Forger, that you received more than a dozen rejections from publishers before Algonquin accepted that book, and that you have kind of a theory as to why that book took a while to get.
Well, I have a long history of rejection.
It's kind of the writer.
Yeah, right. So I have 4 novels that I wrote that never got published. And those first 5 novels that you were talking about, the psychological suspense, nobody read them. They came out and they died. And I was writing The Art Forger as my last book. I was really going to, declare my writing career success. I had published 5 books, with major publishers, and then I was going to go on and do something else. See, this writing was my 5th career or something like that. And so I wrote The Art Forger and decided that I was not going to mess around with genre anymore. I was just going to write a book that I wanted to write. And so The Art Forger didn't fit into a genre. It had history in it had mystery in it had art, it had forgery, but none of these things were strong enough. So, the history was just some journal entries, some letters that Isabella Stewart Gardner had written, and the crime was forgery, so nobody died. And so it just didn't, and there was some romance in it, but it definitely wasn't a romance novel. And so when I gave it to my agent, she didn't want it, because she said she didn't know how to sell it if it didn't fit into a genre. And then I went through 6 more agents before I found an agent who was willing to take it on, knowing that it wasn't in a genre. And she sent it to every major publisher in New York, and every single one turned it down. They said it didn't fit into a genre. So it ended up on the desk of Amy Gash at Algonquin Books, and she loved it. And she didn't care that it didn't fit into a genre, because where the really large publishers publish 200, 300, sometimes 400 books a month, Algonquin publishes 20 new titles a year, only half of which are fiction. So, as Tim says, you're seeing a huge proportion.
You're the
20,
you're
right, 20%, right. You see 20%.
Well, we've got another fiction author in the audience, Chris, so that's, for a third of the...
Here we are! All right. But so they weren't afraid. They turned this book that everybody thought they couldn't sell into a New York Times bestseller. Go figure.
Well, and I should say, you wrote a really good book too, so so tell us your rejection story.
It's a sad story. What I take away from Barbara's story is that no one understood that Barbara was creating her own genre.
Yeah.
I don't know if Barbara even knew it at the time. But now she's had 3 books that follow this kind of art history, mystery kind of. And you can bet there are people out there who want to get on that train. They're out there. They're trying to bring you down.
This is what happens when you finally get up.
Yeah, you get up, someone's going to want to try to bring you down. Well, I had a really similar experience, but for different reasons. And I have to go back to Descent to describe that, my previous novel. And that's how I came to Algonquin. I'd gone through a number of agents myself, and this my agent before the one I have now, when she read the manuscript, she wanted to go right out with it, and I had not had anybody read it really but me. But she loved it, and she wanted to go right out with it, so she sent it to 8 big New York houses, and they all flatly said no. And they said it for a number of different reasons. It wasn't just, we don't know what genre this is. It was for any variety of reasons. And what I realized finally was that the book had just been, it was not ready for prime time. I hadn't worked on it long enough. I hadn't had enough help with it, really. And so what I did was I snuck around behind my agent's back, and I found another agent who had a strong sort of editing aspect to her agency. She had an actual in-house editor who worked on all the books before they went to publishers. And we worked on that book for a good 6 months or so. And my agent then decided that she just wanted to send it to one editor, one publisher, and that was Algonquin. And that was Chuck Adams. And he loved it, and they loved it. And that's how we ended up with Chris and our happy little family.
Just a footnote to our conversation on stage. In the audience that night was fellow Algonquin author Christopher Swan, who wrote the novel Shadow of the Lions. He lives here in Atlanta. You just never know who you're going to be seated next to in the audience at one of these Atlanta book events. Some of the incredible authors and unmissable events coming up this month at the Atlanta History Center and Margaret Mitchell House include Lynn Olson will be here with her book, Madame Forçat's Secret War, the daring young woman who led France's largest spy network against Hitler. That's happening Monday, March 11th at 8 p.m. On March 14th, an evening with a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, North Carolina writer Randall Keenan. He's going to do a short reading and then have a Q&A with Dr. Andy Crank from University of Alabama about the book Understanding Randall Keenan. And the one that I am most looking forward to is coming up on Tuesday, March 19th. Frances Mays, who is probably best known for her memoir, Under the Tuscan Sun. She's back with another book about her Italy. See you in the Piazza. That's Tuesday, March 19th at 7:30 p.m. Just a note, there are some big names coming to Atlanta who have already sold out their events. The March 11th event for Starbucks founder and former CEO Howard Schultz, who's been making headlines as a potential independent candidate for president, is sold out at the Carter Center. And just hours after announcing a joint event featuring Valerie Jarrett, a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama, with former Democratic governor candidate and Georgia House Minority Leader Stacey Abrams. That event was sold out by Karis Books and More at the Carter Center. The same goes for Little Shop of Stories, who is hosting actor Neil Patrick Harris on April 5th at Agnes Scott College. Check in with these bookstores to see if you can get on a waiting list, and if not, then you can always ask to order a signed copy of the book that will be ready and waiting for you after the author has visited Atlanta. Remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website. That's literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you like to get your podcast. Apple Podcast, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.